but we have of late, as many of you know, from semiconductors and cars to sunflower seeds and baby formula, it's an issue. And we have a terrific panel here to discuss it today. Thank you. Great. I'll just give a quick introduction. On our right is Mara Motherway from Peraton. In the middle is Steve Biegun, who's an Aspen Strategy Group member and former State Department official. Then we have Bruce Andrews from Intel and Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times. Thank you.
Thank you, Neve. It's my great pleasure to be here. I was thinking after that last session that I could hopefully offer you something a little bit more optimistic and upbeat, but collapse of global supply chains may not be the exact topic for that, so I apologize on behalf of the panelists. As Neve said, I'm Peter Spiegel. I'm with the U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times. It's a great honor to be on this stage with this panel, and I want to thank Aspen. This is my first Aspen Security Forum. I clearly have got the uniform down, though. Blue blazers. We did not coordinate this. This is a very big topic, and I want to start by sort of trying to put it down into three bite-sized digestible pieces that I'm going to throw at each panelist. The first bit of it, I think, is the big piece, and I will label this sort of economic prosperity. This is what we all know on our day-to-day lives, sort of the everything shortage, right? You know, we moved consumer spending, went from services to goods. We saw container ships outside the port of LA, and suddenly it sparks inflation where our very economic well-being is at risk because of a supply chain crisis. So that's one. Steve, I'm going to throw that at you because in some of our emails early on you want to talk a bit about that. The second bit I will say is I'll label economic security. And by that I mean things that we need in our economy that are being produced by, shall we say, geopolitically unstable regions, geostrategic rivals, and shall we say, countries that are close to geostrategic rivals. So, Huawei 5G, microprocessors, rare earths. That bit I might throw at you, Bruce. And then finally, the last bit I want to address, and I'll throw at Mara, is very, very core national security, which is, frankly, our military supply chain. This is something Richard Spencer talked quite a bit about when he was Navy Secretary, that there may be an Aegis cruiser somewhere in the Pacific right now that has a highly engineered ball bearing, his words, not mine, that is being produced by a geostrategic rival of the United States that we could go to war with. And we do not know that we could suddenly find us unable to get that ball bearing in wartime. So I think those are three separate, distinct things. I want to throw each bit at each of our panelists and then see where the conversation goes. I suspect I know it's going to go. But Steve, let me start with you, because in our email conversations before we got here, you had talked about some of these issues. Particularly, are there areas where the U.S., both from a corporate perspective and a private sector perspective, but also potentially a government perspective, should be refocusing to invest nearshoring, Latin America? We were talking earlier that Secretary Yellen talked about friendshoring. Should we be thinking about putting supply chains in friendly countries? Why don't you take the big macroeconomic piece of this and tell us a little bit what you think about it and if there are policy or just corporate solutions to that?
Great. Well, thank you, Peter. In my introduction, it was mentioned that I was previously a senior official in the State Department, but I also, for 15 years before that, led a team that tracked, assessed, and developed mitigation strategies for the global supply chain for one of America's largest companies, over $100 billion in global purchases with a footprint around the world. Supply chains have always been a challenging issue for companies, but certainly some of the design of both the supply chain and the design of the business strategy itself have created the conditions under which you described as a shortage of everything. Of course, the strategy for corporations, for companies, remains the same. It's to find the greatest scale at the lowest cost with the least possible risk to maximize profits. And that equation will not change for any American company or any company around the world. But what is new is that question of risk and where the risk comes from. And there are new sources of risk: geopolitical tensions, the consequences of an uneven global recovery from COVID-19. So there are new issues that companies are having to deal with. But probably the most significant one is that the governments around the world have a point of view on supply chains. Here in the United States, we are moving towards an unprecedented deepening of industrial policy in which, you could hear it in your question, Peter, the government has a point of view on where private corporations invest and get their supplies. In some places, it's because of public goods like N95 masks or glass vials for vaccines or syringes or what have you, biopharmaceuticals. But in some cases, it's human rights, it's geopolitics, and it's, of course, national security as well. And so this is what's new, is the intensity of these drivers of risk, and something that companies are really having to think long and hard about how to adjust that supply chain to minimize that risk.
Can I just ask you to follow up very quickly before I go to Bruce? On the issue, though, let's put the government aside. Given your background with Ford, if you were purely now looking from a corporate private sector perspective, you're right that obviously the most important thing to be driving is lower cost, higher profit margins. I work for the Financial Times. That is a good thing for the Financial Times. We don't disagree with that. But does the issue of the instability and the black swan, or whatever you want to call it, of the pandemic and everything, do you think that corporate leaders now are going to have to think about other elements other than just lowest cost producers when they start thinking about their supply chain?
Well, not entirely, but your question is the right one. But what drives cost? Risk. So yes, they are in a sense. And this isn't new. But also it's going to force companies to reconsider their business model. It's not just the supply chain, it's just-in-time deliveries. The fragility of the supply chain approach of large corporations during a period of almost unconstrained globalization is clearly changing. And all these factors, the pandemic, the geopolitics, increasingly valuable interests among investors and NGOs as to the corporate philosophy and the countries in which companies operate, all of these are drivers of risk. And risk is poison for the private sector. You can, higher cost, you can price into your product, you can relocate your production, but risk is an intangible, and companies are constantly in search of reducing risk because it's the one thing you can't control for.
Bruce, I think it's a good transition because this gets to your business, and the area I sort of label as sort of economic security is clearly an area that the government feels that where it's been sticking its nose slightly into the broader macroeconomic position. It is much more demanding now in these areas where they perceive to be shortages that are in U.S. interest. Microprocessors being one of them. Again, 5G has been something that both the Trump and the Biden administration have put their nose into on a policy perspective. The Defense Production Act, something that I hadn't heard of until recently, is now suddenly rolled out with some regularity. Talk to me a little bit about what you think the role of government should be when we look at what are being considered critical elements in economic security, and microprocessors being one of them.
Sure. Well, look, I think, ideally in the United States, we've always looked and said, let's let the market sort it out and, let free markets work. The challenge is this is not an area where the free markets have been working for two reasons. One is because, as Steve said, we used to live in a just-in-time world, and we're moving to a just-in-case world. Because what we've learned out of whether it's COVID, ports being shut down, various problems around the world, and to Steve's point, other geopolitical risks, is companies and countries have to hedge against these challenges. And what we've learned also is microprocessors are critically important. Our old company, Steve and I worked together at Ford, they've been idling factories because they don't have access to microprocessors. And so what we're looking at is, for 30 years, the United States has sat on the sidelines while other countries, you can call it industrial policy, you can call it competitiveness, call it whatever you want, but other countries have been engaging. I mean, there is a good reason that a huge percentage of semiconductors are now manufactured in Asia, right? In 1990, the United States was 37% of the world's semiconductor production. Now we're down to 12%, and Intel, we're half of that, so 6%. And the reason that took place is not because other countries are better or smarter or anything else. It's because their governments went out and put incentives, whether that's Korea, Taiwan. They've been very aggressive about putting out incentives. So the challenge here in the United States, because of those incentives, it's about 30 to 40% more expensive to manufacture in the United States. So what the government is looking to do is say, what are key areas where we need partnership with industry and the private sector? Where do we need to help mitigate those cost risks, because the reality is companies are probably not going to manufacture in the United States if it's 40% more expensive, because you can't be globally competitive. And so the role of government in this is to step in and say, where are the key areas? What are the things that we have to have capacity and capability to do? And I think everybody agrees that semiconductors are one of those areas, whether that's for, automobiles or medical devices or defense or, you name it. To be reliant on overseas production would put us at a potential risk. And the other thing is you see other parts of the world stepping up. The Europeans are doing their CHIPS Act. European governments are being incredibly aggressive about trying to locate, semiconductor production to Europe. India's doing it, Japan's doing it, obviously China has done it for years. And so if the US wants to level the playing field, we've got to recognize that there has to be policies in this country that really make it affordable or competitive for US companies to manufacture here.
Let me push you on this, because I think I see the difference here, which is what I was hoping for, frankly, on the issue of industrial policy. I mean, are you not nervous that if the US government says, oh, you know what, just for microprocessors, we need to pick a winner. Oh, you know what, actually, let's also do 5G. Oh, by the way, let's also, and suddenly, we're France. I mean, the French government and the French economy has some strength. They created Airbus through industrial policy. But it is, to be slightly provocative, slightly un-American to say the US government should be picking winners. And now they did it with COVID and very effectively creating a buyer first resort, for lack of a better word, and provided incentives and an amazing success there. But are you concerned at all that we start doing this for microprocessors, that the floodgates open?
No, because for the following reason. This is not government picking winners and losers. This is government providing incentives for the private sector to do this. Because for every dollar that the government spends, private companies will spend at least $3. So what this really is actually a multiplier of investment. And if we're going to locate, the good news about bringing more semiconductor production, for example, to the United States, is it will also bring the supply chain. It will make it affordable for companies to bring supply chain to co-locate around manufacturing facilities here in the United States. I mean, if you look at where a fab goes, and I'll just give you where we are in Portland, where Intel we're the largest employer in Oregon. Portland has become a tech hub for that reason. Or Israel, we're the biggest private employer in Israel. Why did Israel become a tech hub? Because companies like Intel came in, and once you start building the manufacturing, then you get the R&D, you get the technology ecosystem, and the United States has been out of the game for 30 years. So if we want to build those capacities and we build those capabilities, the government has to be a partner to the private sector, or otherwise companies aren't going to invest in the United States. They have many choices around the world, and if we can't be competitive, then they're going to go somewhere else.
All right, Merritt, let me bring you into this conversation. I want to start, at least, throw the question at you that I promised, but obviously, please feel free to weigh in on Bruce and Steve's discussion here. I want to focus first, though, on the national security element of this, which is, do we know what bits of our military hardware are at risk because of supply chains? Again, going back to Richard Spencer's question, do we know whether there are ball bearings in Aegis destroyers, Aegis cruisers that are produced by geostrategic rivals? I know your company's been doing some work on this. You obviously were also a longtime Navy officer and did some work in acquisition as well. So you have both sides, the private sector and the DoD experience in this.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you. I'm really appreciative to be here today. So I think let me just take a step back. I joined the Navy at the tail end of the Cold War. I served the first 9 years pre-9/11 and then 12 after that, so for 21 years. And although 9/11 took a tremendous emotional toll on our nation, our global economy remained relatively stable, and we didn't really worry about supply chain. We worried about logistics, forward basing, getting things up to scale, moving them out forward to meet the speed of need. But supply chain we didn't worry about. And when you fast forward to 2012, series of humanitarian disasters and terrorist threats against our transportation infrastructure, we began to study the supply chain. The Obama administration issued a supply chain strategy. The intelligence community issued its first threat assessment on the supply chain. And then subsequently in 2017, President Trump put another study in place to look at supply chain, though principally focused on the concerns around production of defense goods outside of the United States. The challenge then is that it was all very important studying, but there wasn't that urgency that we're having this conversation about today. And now, 2.5 years of a pandemic, a nation state invading another, this is very urgent. And so more reviews have been done within defense. And just recently, as February, the Defense Department issued its supply chain study. And we could focus on how we got here, which we've talked a little about the geostrategics and the technology. We could focus on those key capabilities. But where I think that it'd be really good to shine that light, Peter, to your question, is around data. Because data is the underpinning of everything. It is our lifeblood. It's king. And in the report in February of 2022, the Defense Department acknowledged that they have data. What they don't have is a central capability to collect, organize, analyze, and share key data to help be proactive in making those decisions. And so my background in defense and in industry, I share from that perspective that I do think the Defense Department has what they need in terms of the data, but where the fundamental issue comes in is how do you prioritize it? And we've talked about whether semiconductors is this near-term threat. Within the Department of Defense, grappling with that data and understanding what is the biggest priority, what is the next thing that we must focus on. Out forward on that ship, there is someone who does understand what that need is, and that person is probably a master chief. They're probably a warrant officer, they're in the supply department, and they understand everything that they can about that. What they don't know is where it came from. But what they don't have is that centralized ability to put that information that they do know in and to have it analyzed and brought back. And so I think that the data piece of it and having a conversation more deeply around that is really critical.
Mayor, can I just ask the thing you raised about urgency? Because having covered defense procurement for early part of my career, you and I both know that Pentagon acquisition people get very excited about new platforms with shiny new things, and you start bringing up long tail and supply chains, and they glaze over. Do you sense a general change in attitude in urgency, given both the rise of China as a manufacturer, but also supply chain disruption over the last 18 months or so? Or is this still lip service? Because you talked a lot about studies, and you're right, there hasn't been a huge amount of action on it yet.
Well, actually, I am seeing a bit of a change. So first, I would say for those who don't follow the defense budget, about 50% of it falls into services. And so when you're in the business of doing system integration and delivering, high-end technical services for missions that cannot fail, you think about what that budget looks like and what the needs are of the mission. And so I have seen in the last few years a change in that. One of the things that's changed is these new software development procurement programs that are pilot programs. And so it's an effort by the Department of Defense to identify programs that need a faster and more robust acquisition path and also more flexibility in the funding. And that enables these programs to be developed using both research and development funding and operations and maintenance funding at the same time. And that is really critical for any federal mission partner who's trying to deliver in agilely and scale for the department.
Steve, let me go back to you, because when Bruce was talking, you're almost jumping out of your chair there. I may have set this up intentionally the way I did it, because I think, at least in my mind, this is a continuum. What Mara was talking about is so clearly the government's business. It is national security. We need to keep track of what is going into our weapon systems. On your end, when I talk to you about what is Ford's supply chain, the government may have a view and an interest, but in the American way of economy, tend not to get that involved in. And then in sort of what Bruce is talking about, we're sort of in between. It's sort of a continuum. And Bruce is obviously pushing for the government to get a little bit more involved in your neck of the woods, and I think you're pushing back a little bit. But can I ask you just to respond to that continuum I've set up and whether it's a good construct?
Sure, thank you, Peter. So in my current position, I'm with the four macro advisory partners. I speak to a lot of senior leaders of companies who have these very questions about their supply chains. And the challenge that they're facing is they don't have very clear direction on where government policy is going. A friend of many of ours here, Ambassador Bob Blackwell, is fond of quoting Friedrich Nietzsche that the foundation of human stupidity is forgetting what we're trying to accomplish. And as the government starts to wade into private sector decisions on supply chains, I am concerned. I actually agree with both of these positions, and I think in the semiconductor industry, we're trying to recover from taking our eye off the ball. But government involvement should be targeted and limited, and it's not. So we have national security concerns that we've talked about. We have societal concerns like access to medicines or critical health equipment like PPE. Who would have thought that these cloth N95 masks that probably turn a fraction of a cent of profit per unit and would only make sense to produce in scales in the millions would become a critical commodity. But we have to anticipate those things. But we also have to be mindful there are other agendas. There's mercantilist behavior, there's national interest, there's Buy America, there's a whole other set of government goals that are laid over this that fairly soon could tie the strength of our own private sector in knots. And I've seen this in the world too. Working with Ford Motor Company, I operated in China under China's Made in China 2025, in India's under Made in India. In Brazil, where a car made in Brazil was more expensive to sell next door in Paraguay than a car made in Thailand because of the nature of their restrictive and constraining trade policies, and ultimately they drove their industries out of business. And I fear for China in this sense is that they will be their own worst enemy. Companies will make logical decisions about the ease of doing business in a market like China. That will have far more consequence on supply chains in China than even the decisions of the United States government.
Bruce, I wonder if the policies you're advocating would fall under Steve's definition of targeted and limited. Question A. But question B, after you answered my other question, I got to thinking. You talked about this is not picking winners, it's more providing incentives. I wonder if you could just flesh that out a bit, the difference between that. And again, I go back in my own brain to the vaccine push, where you did have the federal government stand up and said, I will buy them. I will buy them. You guys please produce them. So it's this concept of buyer of first resort, which was, for someone who's advocate of free market solutions, seemed like a pretty good one. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Or when you say providing incentives, not necessarily picking winners? Tell me a little bit about what you're thinking there.
Sure. Well, the types of incentives I'm talking about is you look at what other countries do to attract investment. Because we have a really simple choice. Do we want to make things here or do we not? And then you also have to look around the world. And as I talked about the cost differential between the US and basically everywhere else in the world. If we want to do it here, we've got to equalize to the incentives other countries put out there. And the challenge with it is, the private sector has a pretty good idea of how to do this. I mean, sophisticated companies like Intel, Samsung, TSMC, Micron, we all look at the analysis, we look at the data, and we say, okay, what do we think the demand is going to be? How many fabs are we going to need around the world? Where do we want to locate them? And then we go and make decisions. And so if it's not done here, it's going to be done somewhere else. So it's not a question of picking winners that either it's done here or it's not done. If it's not done here, it's not done anywhere. The reality is companies are choosing. And I think that's been one of the things that's been interesting in the debate about the funding for the CHIPS Act in Congress is, to your point, Congress has sort of taken its time. And, most things in Congress get done in a 2-year session. So it gets, if it doesn't get done in the beginning of the 2 years, it gets done in the wrap up. And what companies are saying is there's going to be a huge explosion in demand for semiconductors, right? Everything that everyone here uses is going to be increasingly digital. So someone is going to meet that demand. And because of the investment cycles, it takes 3 years to build a fab. Those decisions need to be made today. And we're operating in a world where literally multiple companies said to the US government, we need to decide where we're going to invest in the next 2 months. But if we don't have the certainty that the US government's going to be a reliable partner, we're going to go overseas. The good news is I think we're days away from the CHIPS Act funding being passed in Congress. And what I think you're going to see is a massive wave of investment in semiconductor manufacturing in this country. So it's going to serve the exact purpose what we want it to, which is to unleash private capital by very sophisticated companies who are going to do it somewhere, but we want to make sure it's done here in the United States. So it's a pretty exciting opportunity.
If I'm not mistaken, I think Intel, you talk about where to choose to do it. I think Intel has chosen outside Phoenix, Arizona, which is my hometown. So thank you very much.
Well, yes. It's not just Phoenix, but I will say, and for everybody, watch this, because we've actually announced $43.5 billion of capital expenditure. Arizona, about $20 billion. But what we're doing in Ohio has the possibility to transform not just Ohio, but the Midwest. In 15 years, look what Ohio is going to look like. It's actually, to quote Sherrod Brown the day we announced this, he said, you can officially put the term Rust Belt away because this is going to be, the Silicon Heartland, not the Rust Belt anymore.
one more follow-up, and then Mara, I want to go to you, and then I'd like to spare time for questions from the audience. But you talked about looking what the rest of the world is doing and making sure we're in line with them in terms of incentives. I mean, what about the possibility that suddenly we have a race to the top, to the bottom, whatever it is, that you suddenly saying, you know, we're going to do this, then we're going to one up, and suddenly governments around the world are facing the increasing pressure to put even more incentives on the table?
Sure. Well, so what the thing that's most interesting, it goes to actually the basis of this discussion, is we do see a geopolitical diversification being forced. Companies have concentrated heavily in Asia up until this point, but there is a recognition, to Steve's point about risk and about the risk of having too much concentration. People actually want to build in the rest of the world. So the United States, Europe have this unbelievable opportunity sitting in front of us, because we are at an inflection point where supply chains and manufacturing has become too concentrated in Asia in the minds of a lot of companies, and they want to have the option. So if there, you know, God forbid there's an earthquake or a typhoon or, you know, COVID or all the things that can happen, if you are not geographically diversified, then you're stuck with all of the consequences that come from that. So I think we are at a point where companies are looking and they're saying, hey, we have enough concentration right now, let's look to other places. So there's this opportunity the US has to take advantage of.
Mara, please weigh in on this if you'd like to. But I want one last follow-up to you. You talked about the need to look at the data so that we have transparency as actually where we're getting our critical supplies. If you were to try to look at it now, which I'm putting you on the spot slightly, and maybe we don't know, how worried should we be that some of our most important weapon systems are made from parts from geostrategic rivals? Or do we not actually know that yet?
Well, let me jump in. Before I answer,
please.
let me just jump in on this thematic, because what Steve and Bruce are talking about is forward-leaning industry, making the decisions in time to optimize efficiency for tomorrow, put in the necessary resiliency and redundancy, ensure that investors are aware of the costs that are associated with that, but continue to move out. The department is thinking about what they need to do to centralize data. Commercial industry has already done that for years and years. And so they need industry's help to try to scale and go more quickly, because industry is moving fast, much faster now in the digital world we live in than the department can keep up in. The Department of Defense is optimized for an industrial base, right? They're optimized for more static production of ships and aircraft. And so they do need help, they do want help, they are reaching out, but they're not able to keep up in this fashion. And that is going to create increasing tension for everything from encouraging new workforce to protecting our cyber, you know, to understanding what the capabilities are. In terms of that industrial policy piece and the real threats and vulnerabilities that you've asked, look, I think that there's scoping that's happening. There are certainly knowledge and understanding within the department on capabilities and platforms where some of the most critical vulnerabilities are. Just earlier today, we were talking about the greatest vulnerability of the F-35 is actually the pilot's helmet, right? So certainly there is that knowledge, but the issue is, how do you take the knowledge of the threat, connect it to those who are setting the requirements and determining the acquisitions, and those who are out forward and who are delivering and executing on the mission, who have a need to continue to resupply? How do they know that they're asking for something that is vulnerable? How do they know that it's even vulnerable? And then how do you put that into that centralized system? That's not there yet.
All right, I lied. I need one more follow-up with you then. Given that, where does the DoD sit in terms of, should it be more active in providing incentives? I see a vulnerability X. I need to provide incentives for American companies to invest in this so I don't have vulnerability X. How, you say that it's moving too fast for the Pentagon in many ways, but do you see a role for the Pentagon in being more directive in that regard?
Well, I can't speak on behalf of the department, but I do see a role in the department in collaborating with industry on where they can accept risk and continue to have just in time, and where they have to embrace the redundancy and the resiliency for just in case. And I think in those areas, there has to be a conversation with industry to incentivize it and to fund it and to invest in it. And that truly comes down to really critical, because if that conversation doesn't happen, industry is optimized for efficiency, and industry will make those decisions on their own. And so that's where the real tension and conversation has to happen, and I believe that there's a big desire to have those conversations. It's just sometimes, one person is at the starting line and the other is sort of still looking for shoes, and that can be the case sometimes.
I'm always the one still looking for shoes. I got about 5 minutes left. I'd love to take some questions from the audience. The first hand I saw pop up was right here, this gentleman in the black shirt.
Hi, good afternoon. Patrick Wilson with MediaTek. And my question for the panel seems appropriate to right after this topic because in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, I think a lot of us in the sort of international security world, we saw this great alliance of closely aligned democracies get aligned really quick on technology controls and other things. Do you think there's a role for similar broad alignment on technology procurement among our close democratic allies? I mean, obviously I care about Taiwan, but I look at Holland and Korea, Japan and Europe really did coalesce very quickly around these supply chain issues. Should there be a forum? Should there be a next step to get that kind of close alliance?
Steve, maybe I should have you start with that one since you lived in that diplomatic world for a while. And if I could throw one more element into that, which is there are a lot of companies from allied countries who now find it very difficult to invest in highly sophisticated, high-end technology in the U.S. because of the CFIUS process, which has become a monster since the last time I covered it 15 years ago. Is it almost too difficult now for us to cooperate with our allies, our closest allies, on things like high-end technologies that we should be cooperating on?
In February at the Munich Security Conference, Aspen hosted a technology luncheon with a number of us, including European technology leaders, and we were talking about this very issue and in the context of the Trade and Technology Council. And the great revelation for me from that lunch was that European technology companies viewed America as much as a competitor as they did the Chinese. And so it isn't going to be easy because a lot of times our entreaties to our European counterparts to do this collectively together, for example, through a negotiated agreement in the Trade and Technology Council, is viewed as basically laying bare their market for American technology giants to dominate the European landscape. And so it does breed some resistance. But I think a sense of shared benefit has to animate our policies if they're going to be effective in both defending America's interests, particularly the very important interests that we've been discussing here, and at the same time maximizing the potential of the American economy and the benefit to our friends and partners. So whether it's buy democratic, buy allied, if we narrow it down to buy America and we ignore the point of your question, I think it'll come at great risk to our own economy.
Bruce, you want to weigh in there? I'm reminded that Ericsson, as a rival to Huawei, Ericsson was sort of the next best 5G, and the U.S. decided that, let's do our own. Why would we go to a European rival as opposed to our own, which is kind of what Steve's point was.
Sure. Well, look, the thing I would add to what Steve said, I think it's really important, is the cost of building resilient and diversified supply chains is going to be enormous and is not a cost that any one company or any one country can absorb because it's going to be huge. And so and I think this is what actually Secretary Raimondo, who leads my old agency, is doing, is trying to build on the comparative advantages. Patrick mentioned, ASML is a great example. We've got, world-leading machines. And so as part of doing this, it's really identifying, okay, what parts of the supply chain could evolve in places to build this resiliency and this diversity? Because the reality is, and Mara kind of hit on this, there's going to be a cost. Like moving out of optimized supply chains, there will be a cost, and somebody's going to have to absorb it. And the question is it consumers? Is it companies who then have to deal with their shareholders? Or do governments help? Or is it some broader array of that? Because otherwise, it's just not going to happen.
Mara, can you talk about that issue from a specifically defense tech point of view? Because, again, I'm a bit of a dilettante when it comes to this stuff. My experience is that although there are broad principles stated frequently that we have to cooperate, when it comes to defense tech, issues of national sovereignty come to the fore, even for medium-sized European powers, that they don't trust necessarily to outsource or share technologies with the big bad Americans. Is that a fair assessment, or am I oversimplifying?
Well, I mean, I think that there is always a concern around the sharing of technology across allies and friends, and what that means in terms of the potential risks that we have for sharing technology, and then what it means to be sharing technology with us. At the same time, I have seen, as a nation and as a world, certainly coming together in this particular crisis to identify the best path forward to solve the challenges that are facing the Ukrainians right now, and to come up with a set of shared responsibilities. And so I think that that's a positive move forward. But the technology will always, there'll always be trip hazards around that.
I'm getting my red flashing light here. I had one more question I wanted to get in, but could we make it very quickly? Quick question, quick answer, just to one panelist. I see Neve is now giving me daggers with her eyes. I apologize, Neve.
Sorry. I'm Rebecca Kaiser from the National Science Foundation, and it's a question for Bruce. I think Intel was one of the first companies to establish a plant in the former Soviet Union after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now we have a changing situation in Russia, geopolitical situation in Russia, and I'm wondering what that means for Intel and the location there and thoughts going forward.
So we are a geographically diverse company. We don't have any manufacturing in Russia, but we have operations in Poland. We have operations all over the place. And look, I think companies are making decisions about where to locate much more carefully now, because the reality is we do live in a complicated world. But I also think, we're being given the hook. But to your point, I do think companies are looking much more carefully into the point Steve made earlier. The factors that companies are using to make these decisions are much broader than they probably ever had been before.
With that, so I'll be invited back next year. I'm going to wrap things up. Thank you, panel. Please join me in thanking the panel.
Thanks, Peter. And you're in for a treat. Mr. David Ignatius